According to all cultures all over this planet, the Earth has gone through multiple destructive ages. Now, each of these ages are generally associated with a planet. For example, many mythologies all over this planet start with what is essentially called a golden age. And this golden age is generally always associated with the planet Saturn. Now, Saturn and the Golden Age are generally attributed to kind of the beginning of basically everybody's mythologies, at least in the popular sense, because if you try to find out what happened before Saturn, like what was the age that came before Saturn? Like what the hell was going on before the Golden Age? I mean, there had to be something going on before that, right? You would think that. And yes, you can find a little bit of information regarding an age that comes before the Golden Age, but this is where information gets really sketchy. I mean, hell, even the Saturnian Golden Age information is already sketchy enough. The stories that are told about the Saturnian period, those stories really are told from a legitimate mythological perspective. They're not told from a historical perspective like other ages that come later will be translated down to us. By that I mean there are literally ages that are more closer to us right now that are not really told in a mythological sense. Yes, the stories sound insane, right? There's all kinds of catastrophes and all kinds of crazy stuff that the supposed gods are doing up there in the sky. But a lot of the things that we know nowadays with respect to some of those stories are told very much from a eyewitness testimony perspective, right? The people in the geographical area that were witnessing these events, they recorded those events, and that lines up with what you would expect those people to see in those areas on Earth. When we look back at something like the Golden Age stories, everybody's basically got the same kind of story, and it's told in a very, it's told in kind of a very generic situation. You don't get all these crazy details. You don't get really unique perspectives that you would expect, from people who lived all over the planet. You get very much almost like one perspective. So when you get into the Golden Age mythologies, it really is told as a myth. It's a very interesting situation that we find in history, to where later events will have much more detail, almost to the point to where it's almost scientific notation in some cases. I mean, it's that good in some of the cultures. But when you look back at something as far back as the Saturnian Golden Age, that is very much just a single perspective. It's almost like somebody went around the planet at some point in time in history and simply relayed a general story to all cultures all over the planet. That's really what the evidence shows if you take it seriously, if you look at it objectively. And hell, even cultures around the world will tell you that somebody showed up and told them the story. I mean, how do you like that? I mean, people really do legitimately just say that. They just admit it. None of these cultures say that, oh yeah, our ancestors passed this story down to us. Some do. But other ones literally say, no, somebody came to us and told us this story. So that makes it makes the Golden Age situation interesting. Anyway, the Golden Age is related to Saturn, and that's, pretty far back. But what happened before the Saturnian Age? What happened before the Golden Age? Well, essentially, there's something that is generally called the Primordial Age. And the Primordial Age is generally attributed to the planet Uranus. Now, Uranus is a weird planet, just like Mercury's a weird planet. I want to talk about Mercury today, but Uranus is even weirder because we really have no information on Uranus. I mean, think about it. When you go and you start really looking at everybody's mythologies across this planet, Uranus doesn't play all that big of a role, does it? Right? We have all kinds of stories with respect to Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. I mean, those planets play an extraordinary role in Earth's history. But when you look at something like Uranus and then Neptune as well, things get fuzzy. It gets a little weird, doesn't it? Now, the interesting thing about Uranus is that people actually attribute Uranus as being the primordial creator, like the age that came before the Saturnian age. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. And the real question ultimately is, what does that mean with respect to catastrophism and electric universe theories? So, for example, before the two solar systems collide. Remember, the Saturnian age is a period of time to where Earth is orbiting Saturn with at least Mars, and of course Venus will come later. But where is Uranus during all of this, right? You don't hear anything really. And I have not seen any evidence that really says, oh yeah, hey, by the way, Uranus was doing this, and this is what Uranus did during this point in time. Nobody really has any stories like that that I'm aware of. I mean, if you have one, please link it. I would love to see it. But Uranus, for whatever reason, though, is attributed credit to the primordial time before the Golden Age. And it begs the question, why? Like where was Uranus during the Saturnian configuration? What was Uranus doing? What did Uranus look like? Because don't forget, Saturn did not look like it looks like now back in the day when we were orbiting Saturn. Remember, Saturn would have been a brown dwarf star. And nowadays it's what they call a gas giant. It should be called like a plasma giant or something. I don't know. Anyway, but does that mean that Uranus looked like it does now back then? Or was Uranus in a different kind of an electrical plasmatic configuration? Plasmatic. Is that even a word? Plasmatic? I don't know. So I don't know. That's one of those questions, and it's outside of the scope for this show anyways. But I wanted to lay the groundwork to show everybody, or just to make the point, that there's a lot of questions that we are really in the dark about with respect to planetary bodies. And like I said earlier, Neptune, I have no idea where Neptune fits into any of this. I have no idea where. I mean, Neptune is a weird planet with respect to mythology. And I know we can find stuff, Neptune is the god of the ocean and stuff like that. I know we can get into a little bit of that. But ultimately speaking, where the hell was Neptune during all of the Saturnian configuration breakup? Right? Did Neptune orbit Saturn during that period of time? Was Neptune orbiting the sun before the breakup? I don't know. And the stories don't really tell us. At least that I've seen. So when we look at catastrophism, when we look at the Saturnian configuration breakup, and we just listen to our ancestors, we find a situation to where a lot of planets are accounted for, but some are not. And Uranus and Neptune are those weird ones. And by that, I mean there is not really a Neptunian age, right? There's no really famous Neptunian age. There's no real hardcore famous Uranus age. You can kind of give Uranus some credit, I suppose, because that planet is associated with the primordial time. Yeah, I guess you can do that. So it's interesting to note that almost all of these planets are associated with an age in human history. And this goes on into Jupiter, right? We have the Jupiter period of time. That is associated with, they associate it with order, discipline, things like that. The Jupiter age would have come directly after the Saturnian configuration breakup. Jupiter gets weird as well because Jupiter, by all accounts, becomes our quote-unquote sun for a short period of time. And this happens because Saturn starts to pull away from us, or I should say, we are relinquished from Saturn's orbit as we start to try to find our current orbit around the sun. And interestingly enough, we would have actually froze to death, or something bad would have happened to us. We probably would not have survived unless Jupiter had kind of been in the area during a particular period of time in human history, which also begs some very interesting questions as to how humans were so fortuitous that at just the right moment, the right planet will come by and help us survive a much larger catastrophe. Now, I'm not saying that, it's not that Jupiter shows up and nothing bad happens. Earth is still definitely affected negatively here and there. But, if Jupiter had not shown up, had we not been close enough to Jupiter, we probably would not have survived. And we find that happening several times throughout the Saturnian breakup configuration. It's a fascinating problem that leads to all kinds of very weird conclusions. Okay, anyway, so as the ages go on, we have the age of Venus, we have the age of Mars, etc. And those ages are all very prominent. Now, I know right now you can go do a quick search and you will find ages for things like Pluto and the moon, etc. But what you will not find is the entire planet worshiping Pluto at a very specific time. When I'm talking about ages, I'm talking about ages that the entire planetary population generally agrees took place. So we have the Golden Age, Saturnian Age, right? That's everybody agrees with that. Then we have Jupiter showing up, and we have the Jupiter Age. There is a Venus Age, and that age is rather destructive, but also, apparently it's also related to some kind of birth. And that might be because, when Venus was doing its thing, yes, it was destroying Earth quite handedly a couple times, but simultaneously it also saved the planet because at one point in time it rains down manna, carbohydrates, from Venus's cometary tail. And that essentially saves the entire planet. So that's one of the reasons why Venus is associated with, say, the god of love or fertility, is because Venus was the revitalizer at a very particular point in time. Even though, she's the one that did all the damage. Okay, And then, of course, there's the quote-unquote Mars age. Now, the Mars situation is what I am now attributing to what I'm calling the zero event. The Mars period of time where Mars shows up for a very brief period of time, but does its thing, that's only about 1,000 years old. Anyway, so everybody has these histories. But where the hell does a planet like Mercury fit into all of this? This is my question, because when you start to read all of these mythologies, all of these other planets, they all play very prominent roles. And I mean very prominent roles. No joke. Everybody talks about them. Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, Venus. Mercury is there as well, though it's just not to the same degree as those four planets, but it's certainly not less than, say, Neptune or Uranus. So Mercury kind of falls into this weird, what the hell was going on with Mercury? So right now, if we look at our picture of the Saturnian breakup and we follow that chronology, what is Mercury doing? Where the hell does Mercury show up? How does Mercury affect Earth, etc., etc.? That's what I want to talk about today. That's what I want to go over. Mercury as a god and as a planet is apparently known all over this planet. This really is a planetary body that everybody seems to have some kind of a story associated with, or some kind of almost even an age associated with. And by the way, when I talk about ages, I don't mean, modern day ages to where we're talking about the age of Aquarius or the age of, Capricorn or what. That's not what I'm talking about. The ages that I was referencing and will reference, they're a historical age, not an astronomical age. Just so we get that out of the way. Okay. Anyway, so Mercury, he's a god, right? He's a god up in the sky, and that's the way he's described by cultures. But of course, all of the cultures are talking about Mercury not in the sense of a god. They are specifically talking about the planet Mercury. That's very important to understand. They are not talking about some dude flying around the sky in a toga with wings, slapping people around with, speech or something. That is not how they were representing this. When they say they saw Mercury in the sky doing something, they meant the planet Mercury itself did something, and our ancestors witnessed that astronomical event. And they were just describing it to the best of their ability. And of course, stories get messed up as time goes on and all of that crap, and translations get screwed up. And so what we have nowadays, when we look at something like the stories regarding Mercury, yeah, they sound fantastical. And I get that. They do. And that's another reason why people don't even think about this stuff, because they think that our ancestors were just stupid monkeys running around just making up garbage because they were bored. Nobody was doing that. They were simply recording what they saw. So who is Mercury? So what's interesting is that all cultures all over this planet are very specific in how they relate Mercury to Mercury's deeds. So, for example, cultures talk about Mercury being linked to either speed, communication, and even transformation, depending on the mythology. But it's the speed and communication that I kind of want to focus on. Now, the communication thing is kind of an umbrella term, because communication is going to ultimately mean things like knowledge, speech, stuff like that. Anything to where you are communicating complex information in that kind of a situation. And we'll analyze that weird question in just a little bit. But here, let's set the stage really quick. So everybody apparently, well, I won't say everybody, I can't, specifically say that, but Mercury is known by most cultures all over this planet. So we have Roman mythology knowing about Mercury, we have Greeks, Hindus, Babylonians, Mayans, Aztec, Chinese, Inca, the Egyptians, whoever the hell they were, Mesopotamians had this, and ultimately Zoroastrians also had Mercury playing some kind of a prominent role in their religion or mythology, however you want to look at that. Now, I know you're going to say, or at least some people might say something like, yes, but everybody could see Mercury in the sky, right? Everybody was an astronomer back in the day, apparently, and everybody had nothing else to do other than track the motions of the planets, right? If that's how people think our ancestors saw the sky back in the day. Right, your average historian thinks that the sky that we see now is the exact same sky that our ancestors saw, just a few thousand years ago. And we know that's false now. Our ancestors tell us that's false. And of course, new science, real science, has now shown that to be the case as well. However, your average person just thinks that everybody was an astronomer and they had nothing else to do. So yeah, of course everybody had Mercury as a god. They were just watching it go across the sky. That kind of a claim has always been ridiculous to me. When historians just brush this kind of stuff off, saying and thinking that everybody was an astronomer, nobody today could find Mercury in the sky if I asked them to. Right, in our great time of enlightenment, if I go to your average person nowadays, because everybody is so highly intelligent and much more intelligent than the people who existed thousands of years ago, of course, if I asked them, please point out Mercury in the sky, they would have no idea. They would never be able to find it. Right? Why? Why would you even be able to find it? Mercury is not flying across our sky at 1,000,000 miles an hour. You know what I mean? You're not going to look up and watch the planet just zip on by, right? It's not obvious. Mercury, at best, is just a dot in the sky. It blends in with all of the other stars. Why the hell would you ever worship or call a little dot in the sky, and a small dot at that, some kind of a crazy god? Why would you do that? It doesn't even make sense. I hate when historians downplay this obvious stupid thing. Nobody would be worshiping or attributing, language and wisdom and thought to some kind of small speck in the sky that your average person would have no clue moved across the sky at any point in time in history. The people would have been just like they are back in the day as they are today if the sky was exactly the same as it is today. Our ancestors thousands of years ago would not be able to find Mercury either. There might be a couple of astronomers who might have a good idea of it if the sky was the same, But nobody's going to know this, and certainly nobody is going to worship Mercury or ascribe Mercury any of these deeds. I mean, why would you? I mean, just imagine this. You're the emperor of some crazy huge empire, and you're sitting there in your palace, sitting there on your throne, surrounded by strippers and money and ice cream, and you're just chilling, getting fed grapes or whatever, doing crack, whatever you gotta do, right? You're the emperor. And then all of a sudden, the doors to your chamber burst open, and some dude starts running through saying, Sire, I figured it out. I have found the god of knowledge. I know who the traveler is. And you're like, oh, really? Oh, okay. So, you get up, you push the stripper to the side, hit that last crack pipe, and then you start following him out to the, the balcony outside. He takes you out there, and you guys look up at the stars, and he points to one of the trillions of little points of light in the sky. And he says, Sire, that is the god of knowledge, right? And he looks at you, and you're like, what? What the? Wait, are you going to look at that dude and say, oh yeah, wow, very smart. Oh, you figured it all out. Thank you, crazy astronomer guy. I'm glad that we now know who the god of knowledge is. I'm glad we now know who is responsible for, I don't know, traveling or whatever. Like, no, you're not doing that. You are going to have that dude executed because it's a waste of your time. There is nobody looking up at the sky back in the day and pointing to a random star in the sky and saying that it is a god of anything. Like, it's just not happening. It's not going to happen. Nobody's going to worship or even attribute anything to a small dot in the sky because nobody would care. Right? This is one of the ways that we know, and it's just common sense. This is one of the ways that we can prove that the night sky was completely different from what it is today. It's right in front of us. Now, for me, Mercury gets weird because one of the things that I've been trying to do is trying to figure out chronologically where Mercury fits in to all of these other events that takes place. Right? Is it before or after the Venus event, right? And I would imagine it's before the Zero event. I would imagine this takes place after the Golden Age or Saturnian event, but does it take place before or after, the Jupiter age? This is where things get a little weird, and one of the reasons why it gets a little weird is because not everybody's mythologies has been carried down to us in a perfect chronological order. That's actually one of the bigger problems that we have with mythologies, because we have to remember, the mythologies that have made it down to us today, these things have gone through multiple translations. Even the cultures who tried to preserve them, even those cultures may have changed things a little bit as well, because ultimately, as time passes, even though it is the culture's own history and mythology, as time passes, the disconnect just starts to show up. So the stories start to sound more and more crazy when you are not seeing that stuff happening in the sky, right? So for example, when the Mayans are telling all these stories about Venus destroying the planet and all these crazy things happening, and then when all of that passes, and then let's say 300 years, passes, that generation who is 300 years, away from that, they're going to look around and be like, were our ancestors insane? I mean, what the hell was wrong with great grandma? I mean, where was the meth at? Because they had the good stuff. I mean, why are we not getting that stuff now? Because the way they talk, I mean, that's the problem, right? So those cultures, they would look at their own mythology and they would start to say, well, maybe we can normalize this a little somehow. Anyway, so those are problems that we have to deal with. And this is one of the problems that we have to deal with Mercury. Because Mercury does not play, as far as I can tell, that huge of a role like somebody like Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. played. Right, so what role did these guys even say that Mercury played anyway? Let's do that. So in Roman mythology, and Roman mythology gets weird because if we factor in real chronology, that means the Rome that we think we know actually took place during the Middle Ages. which then means that the quote-unquote mythology must be something that the Middle Ages Romans had access to, from an earlier culture that they would eventually take credit for. Right, and that's a whole other, different ball of wax, but isn't that interesting? But anyway, generally, Roman mythology, they attribute Mercury to being, playing the messenger of the gods, right? And he's also associated with trade and thievery. So if we head on over to Greek mythology, we have Greeks calling him, once again, he's the god of the travelers, he's a thief, he's a commerce god, and in this case, he apparently at some point guides souls down to the underworld. Now, that's actually interesting, because the concept of the underworld comes into play relative to the Saturnian configuration breaking up. Don't forget, Saturn is, well, in Egyptian mythology, for example, Saturn is Ra. He's the one that goes down to the underworld and then comes back up swathed in bandages, right? As Saturn no longer plays a role and drifts away from Earth, the Egyptians gave him and made him become the god of the underworld, because he probably quite literally either went below the horizon for a long time, and then when he reemerged, he looked nothing like the brown dwarf star they were used to, right? He looked more like the planet we see nowadays. And so, he became the god of the underworld and was no longer, the golden age god of happiness and smacking each other on the butt, eating grapes. He wasn't doing that anymore. Anyway, so the underworld plays a very interesting part in mythology in respect to that. Because what the hell does the underworld even mean? So what I just said about the Egyptian thing, does it mean that the planet just went below the horizon for a while? That's a possibility. Does that mean that maybe Mercury was in the area and they watched, and in cultures back in the day were able to watch the planet Mercury maybe rise up before Saturn started to rise up? And that is why they call him the guiding of the souls to the underworld, or going down. I don't know, but that's the kind of stuff we have to look for. We have to start taking things like the underworld seriously. All right, anyway, so if we move on to Hindu mythology, in Hindu mythology, he's more associated with intellect, communication, and general wisdom in astrology and mythological stories. Once again, we find a situation to where Mercury, he's about knowledge, and we will find this as a common denominator in many cultures. And the question is why? Why? I can see why you would look at, when Venus is the long-haired star, quote unquote, when Venus is in cometary mode and it's doing its flybys of Earth and it's destroying Earth, you call it the destroyer. That makes sense, right? Venus is destroying Earth. Yes, Venus the destroyer. Makes sense. Why, even if Mercury does a flyby of Earth, regardless of how close, why the hell would you call it the god of wisdom? Right? So what if a planet does a flyby? You would expect maybe some negative consequences, as we have precedents for all throughout, this whole chronology. But for some weird reason, everybody all over the world decides to associate Mercury with intelligence, with communication, with general wisdom. Why? I don't know. It's just... We'll explore it a little bit. By the way, in this show, I don't have answers for a lot of stuff. In fact, I really don't have any answers. We're just going to go over this as we're going to look at information and maybe see if we can't pick apart some of it, because Mercury is a weird one. I'm still trying to figure out where this thing is, where the hell this planet plays its role in all of this chronology. What stages did it influence the most? And maybe the concept that everybody says that, hey, Mercury is the ushering in of wisdom, maybe that does mean something to the world. Maybe there's something there, something that we're not quite prepared to look at in the way we need to look at. I don't know. Anyway, so if we move on to somebody like the Babylonians, right? The Babylonians, they accredit Mercury with being the god of writing, wisdom, and communication. Right? And it's not all the time. Babylonian mythology gets weird because Babylon, or the Babylonians, they the names of their gods, they keep switching around. And that's another problem that we have in mythology as well, right? We have an issue to where we find ancient cultures, they don't seem to always stick with the same name that they gave their gods initially. Right, so you'll have something like Enki and Ea, right? You'll get those two guys. It gets weird. It's the same damn person, but they give them two different names. Now, is that because maybe we are translating something wrong? Maybe. Or is that because they were trying to represent two separate principles? I don't know. But it's something that we also have to watch out for, because one of the things you can push back on in this video is you can say, well, I mean, Mercury was also attributed to X, Y, and Z in this culture, and I don't disagree with you. I don't. I'm just talking about the general stuff, but that's kind of one of the problems that we run into. And getting over that's going to be a pain in the butt. I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, it's crazy. If we look over to Maya mythology, we have a situation to where the Mayans, they believed that Mercury was a messenger between the upper and underworlds due to its rapid movements. Now, we have two key interesting points right here. They are talking about Mercury moving quickly. Now, up until this point, we have heard of some cultures talking about Mercury being a traveler. And of course, traveling would be referencing some kind of movement. Now, isn't it interesting that Mayans are willing to say that it moves, that they can notice the movement at all? And once again, do not start with me with the garbage modern day astronomy, okay, of tracking the movement of Mercury over years and decades. I don't want to hear it. That's dumb. There's no reason the Mayans would have done that. They would have just said, hey, we see something up in the sky moving. We're going to say it was moving, right? Let's just give them credit for what they're saying. So it's interesting to think about that maybe people were quite literally in a position back during whatever period of time that this took place to where they could just watch the planet Mercury, go across the sky relatively quickly. And of course, this is the kind of stuff we would expect to happen if the Saturnian configuration in some form or another, actually did exist and then broke up. We should expect to see all of these planetary bodies flying around and doing stuff, and that's exactly what is being described. Now, the other point that the Mayans make, of course, is they talk about the upper and underworlds. See, once again, we have this same concept, and it begs the question, what the hell is the underworld? Right? I really want an answer for this, and I don't have one right now. It could be something as simple as, the planetary bodies going below the horizon for a period of time. Think about it like this. I know that might sound stupid and might make it sound like the Mayans are stupid people or any of these cultures are stupid, but think about it like this. If Mercury was much larger in our sky, let's just say maybe a quarter of the size of the moon that we see today. Let's just say that. If you could see Mercury, if Mercury was close enough to where you could see it at that size, right, you would be able to track its movements fairly quickly. It would not be a big problem. Every day you would just look up in the sky and be like, oh yeah, there he goes, right? There goes Mercury. He's moving around. And then when you couldn't see him, let's say his orbit dips down behind the horizon, which would happen, right? Because if you're a Mayan and you're over there in the South American, Central American-ish area, if you're one of those cultures, the orbital paths, it would go behind the horizon, and it might stay behind the horizon for a long period of time, depending on its orbit, and it might, lead and or follow Saturn with it. So they would see it go to the quote-unquote underworld. And in their case, it would look like the planet was going down, even though they're closer to the equator, and it's more like, it's going around the side of the planet. But for their terminology, they did not think, I would imagine they do not mean it literally, like like the planets were going to some kind of a mystical underworld. Like, they don't mean it like that either. They probably just used that term, or that term is just how it's been translated to mean it went out of sight. It went below the horizon, right? And then eventually it rose back up. And of course, it was orbiting with other planetary bodies, and maybe other planetary bodies were synchronously orbiting each other, close enough to where it looked like they were following each other. So it may have looked like Mercury was guiding, something like Saturn to the quote unquote underworld. And even more interesting, remember, if all of these catastrophes took place, like if all of this chaos is real, we would expect, huge debris fields. And we hear about those descriptions, right? We hear about all these cometary bodies flying around. We hear about these debris fields during certain periods of time, either impacting Earth or our ancestors watched those debris fields impact other planets or affect other planets, etc., etc. They probably saw other cometary bodies, not cometary, cosmological bodies, astronomical bodies up there, also, just orbiting around that we don't have today because now they're gone for whatever reason. For one reason or another, those bodies are now gone. Remember, everything doesn't have to be a planet. They could have just been large chunks of debris, right? Large asteroids, etc., floating out there, and they could have seen that stuff. And if they were electrically charged, they would have had a glow of plasma, right? It would have essentially been a comet, basically, right? And you would see those things. So when they say Mercury was guiding people to the underworld, or souls, or whatever you want to call them, maybe they are referencing the other cosmological debris bodies up in the sky that they saw, right? That were trailing Mercury, or that were orbiting in front of Mercury, like that. I mean, the description-wise, that makes sense. You can literally pull out orbital mechanics from these descriptions. Okay, anyway, that's the Maya side. So they've also got the underworld. Yeah, so let's move on over to the Aztecs. The Aztecs have essentially the exact same description for Mercury. Once again, Mercury is going to be associated with movement, and it's going to be associated with guiding souls to the underworld. Or just generally guiding souls in general. Okay. Once again, we find a situation to where Mercury seems to be in an area to where there are other cosmological bodies. And we would expect that, right? We would expect that if we had all this kind of chaos going on. So we have another culture telling us, or confirming, the exact same kind of a thing. Now, the interesting thing with the Aztec mythologies is they relate Mercury as being the twin of Quetzalcoatl, which is interesting because Quetzalcoatl is Venus.
Venus.
So we have a situation to where a culture is willing to state that Mercury is related to Venus in some manner, and in this case, they're just saying, hey, they're twins. Now that really begs the question, why? I mean, why would you relate Mercury as Venus's twin? What the hell's going on with that? So it's something to think about. I mean, does that mean, is that more proof that they actually witnessed Venus much closer to Earth than how we see it today? Because why would they call it the twin? I mean, you would only call it the twin. There's no reason to call Mercury Venus's twin if you just look up at the sky. I mean, what kind of lame excuse could you possibly come up with? I would love to hear what dumb crap cosmologists would say nowadays to try and explain why the Aztecs would call Venus Mercury's twin. Like what would they come up with? Oh, well, they're both kind of specks in the sky, and they both orbit closer to the sun than Earth. Yeah, that must be why they call it the twin. That has to be the answer. There can be no other answer. Now stop asking questions and believe whatever I say. Like that's probably what they would say. But if we look at it using new history and real science, what that might actually mean is that, hey, they may have actually seen, what we know, they saw Venus large in the sky. Does that mean that Mercury was also pretty damn close by to where they could see that planet as well? I mean, maybe they could see both of those planetary bodies, and maybe at a certain point in time, they looked about the same size. If that's the case, then that means Mercury came pretty damn close to the planet. If that's the case. Now, does that mean they saw them simultaneously? I don't know. I'd have to dig more into the Aztec mythology to see if that's possible. But it's not impossible. But it's also possible that that Mercury would come at a later date after the Venus event. Or maybe even before. Like that's the chronology we have to dive into. And some of you might already have the answer to that, actually. I just haven't dug into it enough to really make a good statement on that. It's just something to think about, though. So if you are into Mayan mythology, maybe dig into that. Maybe you can be the one that makes that good discovery that builds that chronology that will help us build up the orbital mechanics of all of those planetary bodies back in the day. Because that's one of the problems that we actually need to figure out. If we can create and figure out the orbits of the planets that they had back in the day, right? If we can recreate that to some degree, like that would give us some predictive properties, which means that way we could actually see if that stuff lines up with other catastrophic events that will happen later on. And if that starts to work out, what that means is that we are conclusively beginning to prove what actually happened in our past. That is what the potential is here for all of that. Okay, anyway, let's jump over to China, because China also has mythologies based around Mercury. So over in China, Mercury corresponds with water for some weird reason. But once again, it also represents communication, adaptability, and wisdom. See, it's this reoccurring theme: communication, intelligence, wisdom. What is going on with this? Like, why? Okay. Now, the water element is interesting as well. One of the things that I have learned with respect to Mercury, and you'll see this when you kind of bounce around, when you look at other cultures, is that Mercury has also kind of been given, no, not kind of, Mercury is also given credit for some catastrophes as well. And one of the catastrophes that Mercury is given credit for is some pretty major floods. Now, before we separate Mercury into its own specific solo catastrophic category, I would put the brakes on right here. Because it's interesting that the Chinese mythology, and there's other cultures as well, which I'm sure we'll get into, that do relate Mercury to some kind of flood event. In fact, we will talk about it when we get into some of the, well, we'll get there. They relate to that. They relate water to Mercury because Mercury is associated with a catastrophe regarding some kind of a major flood. Not a major flood like the deluge, nothing like that. So it's a completely different concept. Think of it more like a classical flood. However, when we read about something like the Aztecs talking about how Mercury is Venus's twin, yeah, it begs the question. What if Mercury was in the sky at the same time that Venus was up there as well? And just, over there in Chinese mythology, they just gave credit to Mercury over Venus for the mountain of water that would eventually, splash down and flood all of East Asia. Like, maybe that's what's going on. That might actually be it. And that would make sense because, why not? If both planetary bodies are in the sky, You could give credit to one or the other. They would technically not really know which one was causing the electromagnetic disturbance, right? They would not know the charge of Venus. They would not realize that, Venus had a very, very nice positive charge and Earth had a very nice negative charge, which is why that catastrophe was taking place in the first place. They would not have known that. They would not have known who to directly blame. So if you saw two planetary bodies in the sky simultaneously, and you're just sitting there waiting to die, you don't, who do you give credit to? I don't know, maybe the one that you like the best, and maybe that's the one they liked the best. They just preferred Mercury. Though, once again, it begs the question, why are they giving Mercury credit for, wisdom? Okay, let's jump over to Incas really quick. I just kind of want to go through all of these guys because the Mercury question, it's a big question. And obviously I am not going to get through it on this show, so we'll just use this episode as like a foundation. And then in another episode, we'll dive deeper into more of the Mercury mythology, and then we'll see what else we can put together. All right. So anyway, Incas. They are another culture that has the exact same relations, right? They talk about Mercury being swift in the sky and a messenger to the gods. The messenger aspect is interesting as well. So it makes you wonder, is Mercury just bouncing back and forth in between the various larger planets? And I don't mean that literally. What I mean is, relative to the orbital mechanics and how we would view, close planets to Earth, it could potentially, depending on where Mercury is, with respect to its orbit in between planets or in front of planets or whatever, it could make it look like Mercury is traveling back and forth between planetary bodies. It's also possible, that maybe somehow Mercury was bouncing back and forth between planetary bodies. And that might be reminiscent to the, strings on a pearl formation back during the Saturnian configuration. But I don't know about that. I don't know if at this stage Mercury would be doing that. In fact, I have some problems with that particular formation and how long it lasts anyway. And that's another show as well. Okay. Let's keep moving. So let's go over to Egypt. So in Egypt, Mercury is called Thoth. And we all know Thoth, right? The great tablets of Thoth. And Thoth is the guy who runs around bringing great wisdom to you and slapping you around with books. That guy shows up and you have to learn, right? It sucks. You're like, God damn it, Thoth is here again. Now we got to learn all this garbage. He's going to make us, Thoth shows up. It sucks. It's like going to school. I'm just kidding. I don't know. But Thoth, he's this great wisdom dude over there in Egyptian mythology. And Thoth, he plays a pretty huge role with respect to the mystery schools and all of that. So that actually begs the question, Thoth is related to the planet Mercury. What the hell does the planet Mercury have to do with the mystery schools? Is there something deeper there? I don't know, right? This is where it gets crazy. But once again, Mercury is being associated with intellectual capability and writing as well and communication over there in Egypt. All right, I still don't understand how a planetary body is doing this, but okay. Okay, moving on. In Mesopotamian culture, Mercury plays a significant role as a celestial body in their stories. And once again, he is associated with wisdom, communication, and writing. Right? It's that same common theme. It's all over the place. So with all of that said, we have a pretty good foundation that really does say something to the effect that Mercury had to have mattered to some degree in our ancestors' past, and it had to have been more than just a little dot in the sky, right? It had to have, something else had to have been going on. But what exactly went on I mean, that's the real question. What were the events that were directly caused by Mercury itself? Or, kind of as we also saw, Venus may have also been playing a part simultaneously. So that's another problem that we have to figure out. That's going to cause more confusion, because now we potentially have two different planetary bodies in the sky messing with our ancestors. And it's also possible, that they were not constantly together in the sky. There could have been times where it was just Mercury, right? Depending on the orbits at the time, it could have just been Venus. And because our records, they're not that detailed, if we're honest. I mean, the reality is we don't have a ton to work with. So we can very easily imagine a time where all of these events were taking place, but due to the nature of the events, right, everything was, fairly catastrophic, the information during this period of time would have been potentially scrambled anyway, and then the survivors and the people who would have looked back at these events, they could have very easily misconstrued things. They could have put events together that didn't actually take place. That's just one of the problems that we have to deal with, and that's a real situation. And more to that point, check this out. All right, so Mercury is talked about as, I'm not going to say the god, but for whatever reason, he's related to communication. He's related to languages. There's a school of thought that potentially Mercury could have been the quote-unquote god that destroyed the Tower of Babel and then for some weird reason, switched up all of the languages. Now, I get it. Now, initially, that whole story sounds insane. And at face value, I'm with you, right? I mean, the way the Tower of Babel is spoken about, essentially, one day everybody's all good, then there's a catastrophe, and the next day everybody is speaking a different language. There's a lot of problems with that. I think we can all agree with that. It's one thing to say that there was a bunch of people who all spoke the same language and they were building a project. Nothing weird about that. Hell, they could have literally even been trying to build a tower up to a god. Maybe they were. I don't know. There's nothing unrealistic about that. They could have been trying to do that. There could have been a general Earth-wide culture at that period of time that did have one language. I don't know, right? This event, if it is related to the Venus event in any shape or form, this takes place between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. At least, probably like 25 to 3,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. So it's entirely possible that humans actually maybe did speak all of a same language. I don't know. The point is, though, is that the story has the tower get destroyed by, a god, and then the next day everybody is speaking a different language. And then, of course, the story then goes on to say, everybody was punished and blah, blah, blah. But check this out. So this actually, there's an interesting angle to this. And there's a couple things to think about. So the Tower of Babel story is generally attributed to more of a biblical situation in modern times. If you hear about something like the Tower of Babel, the vast majority of people are going to think Bible, right? They're going to think God, but they're going to go in that direction. And that's a very Westernly mindset. Nothing wrong with it. But that's the popular version. A lot of people don't realize that there are not countless, but there are tons of cultures out there that have this almost exact same story. And I've talked about this in some older show. Maybe we'll redo that one day now that maybe the channel's slightly better. Probably not. Okay. Anyway, but the Tower of Babel story, it's not just owned by the Bible. We have a situation to where Mesopotamian mythology has that same story. Mesoamerican mythology has it, right? The Aztecs and the Mayans, they have that same kind of a mythology. It's in Greek mythology, Hindu mythology. It's in African mythology. Yeah, it's even over there in Africa, right? It's like the Kikuyui myth and the Tonga myth. Both of those tribes have a similar story to where people were speaking one language, they were building a tower to the heavens, and then it was struck down by a god. The Tower of Babel story is in Chinese mythology, Native American mythology, Central Asian and Siberian mythologies. It's everywhere. It's even in North's mythology. I almost said North, I know. They're North. They're kind of North. Okay, anyway. Why is that? Right? That's a very interesting problem. What's even more interesting is the problem of the speech aspect. Like I said earlier, building a tower, whatever. Anybody could build a tower up to heaven. I'm not saying you can do it, but you can certainly try. Right now, you could run outside to your backyard or in the middle of the street, start piling up garbage, and say you're building a tower to heaven. Right? You can do that, and you would be technically building the tower. You're not going to succeed, right? But you can do it. So the tower portion is not hard to believe, and I don't think a lot of people realize that separation. Right? There's nothing mythological about building a tower to the sky. You can try to do that. Right? There's nothing weird. Anyway, but why do we have all of these cultures with that exact same concept? But then it's followed by a god coming along and destroying the tower. Right? Everybody has this concept. So if we look at this in the context of something like, Mercury being a planet, it makes a little bit more sense. Because as we now know, planets or planetary contacts with Earth definitely cause destruction. So it's entirely possible that Mercury is blamed for the Tower of Babel collapsing because Mercury did indeed do a close flyby of Earth during a particular period of time. Now, could Venus have also been involved? Maybe. Some of the mythologies talk about gods, plural, right? It's not just one god. The Bible has one god, obviously. But in a lot of other mythologies, they do blame a plurality of gods. It's not just one. Something to think about, right? And I know time is kind of an issue right now. I won't belabor the point too much, but I do want to go over some of this stuff. So it's entirely possible that Venus was also in the sky during this period of time. But it begs the question, regardless of Venus being there or not, Mercury apparently is the god that gets all the credit for the destruction. Right? And why do we come to that conclusion? Well, at the end of the day, for some weird reason, everybody blames the whole communication and speech situation on Mercury. Mercury shows up, destroys the tower of a culture who all spoke the same language, and then suddenly everybody speaks a different language afterwards. And that's the way the story is told, by the way. It's not like the tower is destroyed and then, people scatter, and then over decades and, centuries, everybody magically creates other languages for some weird reason. That's not how the story is told. For some weird reason, Mercury shows up, annihilates the tower, and then is also blamed on some kind of a weird speech phenomenon. So what the hell is going on? Now, if you look at this situation purely from a mystical perspective, you can write it off. You can just say, well, God, God's a god. God can do whatever the hell he wants. He wanted to smite all of these people and make sure that nobody ever built another tower of garbage up to me. So, he could just do that. All right, so I can't argue with religious people on that. So I have to move on. But what if we look at this scientifically and we take the story seriously? So we have enough evidence to definitely warrant blaming Mercury on destroying some kind of a culture's, trying to build a tower up to heaven, whatever the hell that means. And a side note, okay, also, I'll just say this. There's scholarship out there, by the way, that the quote-unquote Tower of Babel may actually have been some kind of a... I don't want to use the term spaceship. that's not the right term, but some kind of a way that you could actually maybe legitimately get up to the heavens. If you could build an airplane, right? You could say, well, yeah, I flew up to the heavens. I made it up there. It's actually possible. There is some scholarship out there that actually translates some of this and says, hey, look, the people who were building the quote-unquote tower, the tower is a mistranslation. The tower is supposed to have been translated as to something else that meant, getting up into the heavens through some kind of technological means. Right? I won't go further into that because that gets weird. And I'm not saying, by the way, that is the case. I'm just throwing it out there. All right? It is interesting. Anyway, let's just stick with it being a structure. I mean, regardless, the quote-unquote tower gets destroyed, right? So even if it was like a launching pad for some kind of crazy flying UFO, it gets destroyed, and they don't make it. So it kind of doesn't matter what it is. They were building some kind of a structure. Mercury shows up, destroys it. Now, the descriptions of the destruction, everybody is very similar. You have huge earthquakes. You have an incredible hurricane. And the hurricane is generally what is given credit for the destruction. Now, as we know, if a planetary body is getting too close to Earth, you're going to have stuff like that going on, right? You are going to have disturbances of the crust. You are going to have disturbances of the atmosphere. Disturbances of the atmosphere would indeed lead to some pretty insane weather. And of course, everybody reports, especially when Venus shows up, crazy hurricanes. I mean, absolutely insane winds. So much to the point even that cultures literally blame mountains being built up and annihilated overnight because of the winds. That's how powerful this is. As another side note, if you don't believe that, I mean, it's not really that difficult to believe a strong wind blows stuff away. But there's a whole electrical dynamic to that as well. Right? There's a whole, anyway, you can build mountains up overnight using electricity. Like, it gets crazy, using electrical wind and all of that. Anyway, that's probably what they saw. Okay, moving on. But the Tower of Babel would have been destroyed by these winds. So Mercury does its flyby for whatever that means, right? I don't know the details, and I'm entirely willing to believe that maybe Venus is who should have gotten the credit. Because don't forget, remember, some cultures call Mercury Venus's twin. So there could have been switch-ups, right? People could have mistaken Mercury for Venus. That's also entirely possible. Yeah, just something to think about. Anyway, okay, so Mercury does its flyby. But the reason why the destruction happens, generally speaking, is because of electrical contact. You have two charged bodies, or maybe 2 plus charged bodies, messing with each other. You're going to have all kinds of effects. Now, as humans, we are electrical beings. A lot of people don't realize it, but one of the reasons why you're stuck to Earth is because of electromagnetism. And I'm not going to go crazy into it. But for example, your feet are positively charged and your head is negatively charged. You literally have current running through the top of your head down into your feet into the Earth. And that's a scientific fact. The air acts as a dielectric, so if you are wondering why you are not constantly being zapped and you aren't just a pile of ash, it's because the air, the atmosphere, acts as a dielectric and essentially keeps you insulated. So you're not constantly being zapped every 2 seconds. Now, a quick side note. One of the ways that you can alter a person's psychology is through electroshock therapy. Basically, you can pass current through a person's brain, and what studies have shown is that you can manipulate the brain in all kinds of crazy ways. Right? That's also just a scientific fact. What happened, or what is it possible that during the destruction of the Tower of Babel, and I'll just use that term generically, because all cultures have the story for some weird reason. What happens, or is it possible that when that area was struck with electromagnetic energy, could it have possibly altered the physiological brain makeup and the brain chemistry of everybody in the area? Is it possible that new languages could have literally spawned on the spot? Now, okay, I get it. That sounds absolutely insane, and I agree, right? We're probably taking it a little too far, but nobody really thinks about the physical, psychological consequences of electromagnetic disturbances on a catastrophic scale. What is happening to the human brain during all of these electrical events, right? We are not immune from all of that. If you have that kind of electrical activity going on all around you, you are going to be affected by it. You are either going to be vaporized, you are going to be maybe singed, or maybe you're going to have your hair stand up on your arm, or is it possible that your psychological makeup is altered on the spot? Now, this might sound crazy at first, right? At least the language part of it. You can't argue with me with changing people's psychology through electroshock therapy. That's a scientific fact. There's been so much study on that it's ridiculous, right? It's crazy. The amount of change that you can induce in a human going through those kinds of therapies, it's mind-boggling. All right, it's actually fairly scary, and it really does make you wonder what the hell's going on with humans. The fact that you can do that, the fact that electricity has that kind of effect on human physiology, that's not something we can just walk away from and just be like, oh yeah, whatever, that's normal. That's very interesting. But what if a very particular electrical event were to strike an area? Is it possible that it might strike an area in just the right way to where it alters human consciousness in that particular area in a very particular way? And in this case, is it possible that for some weird reason, when that electrical activity went down and changed the brain's physiology, is it possible that suddenly humans had access to other languages that they never originally knew? This might sound crazy. I get that the concept of that is crazy, but here's the problem with human physiology and language. We actually have no clue where language came from. Like, if any linguist is honest, there's no connection from going from Ooga Booga to, English. There is no such thing as a clear, perfect evolution of that. It's not even close. We literally don't have any of the evidence that shows that humans actually evolved a language. When we look back in history, language is just there. I mean, it just exists. That's the fascinating part about this. And a lot of people don't really want to talk about that because the implications change history. Right? That if everybody has a language right at the beginning, for example, right, that kind of gets rid of a lot of current theories, doesn't it? That causes a problem. But right now, the evidence supports that claim. I'm not going to get into all of the anatomy of the brain and all of the speech areas and stuff like that, but if you do just a very cursory look over what we kind of understand right now of how language works in relation to neurology, language uses multiple parts of the brain. However, you remembering a language, like you actually remembering a word, we have no clue where that stuff is stored. We actually have no idea where any human memory is stored, actually. Did I just say actually like 10 times? It's a good thing we're not doing shots to actually. But one of the things in neurology is that we do not know where memories are stored. We do not know where the memory of language comes from. Now, this opens the door to a whole other aspect, and this is kind of beyond the talk now. But what if language is not native in your head? What if it's not something that you picked up on in the sense of, hey, I learned this because I heard it and it was stored as a memory in the brain, and then my brain is able to light up and utilize that memory to, create speech patterns? We don't have evidence for that. We know that the brain uses various aspects of the brain to put together speech patterns. But where is the actual word stored? We don't know. We have no clue where any of the memories of the word is stored. For example, it's entirely possible, and I'm just going to have fun with this, it's entirely possible that that the brain is simply a receiver, right? What if the brain is just receiving a transmission or something, and in that transmission is language? What happens if you change the physiology of the brain and you change the brain's receiving pattern? Is it possible that you would instantly be able to speak a separate language, a different language that you did not even know about, simply because the transmission always existed there? It's just that your brain couldn't pick up onto it until Mercury did its flyby and zapped the hell out of the area. I know it's crazy, but hey, you know what? There's real science there. All right. Now we can look at the other side of this as well, and we can say that, okay, fine, Mercury came by, it destroyed some kind of a structure, whatever the structure was, and then, people scattered all over the place because it was a catastrophic event. It's not like the tower just fell and everybody just hung out and scratched their butts and was like, damn, that sucks, bro. Well, what do we do now? Like, they didn't do that. Everybody was either killed or spread out all over hell and back due to the earthquakes, the winds, etc. So what the story could also mean is just that as people fanned out, they magically created new languages, and then that's how the languages changed. Yeah, the history of language is very interesting. It's crazy stuff. Anyway, so is that why Mercury is given the credit for being the god of communication? Possibly. Right? What if that event is what everybody would remember down the line? What if that Mercury event, if that's what it was, and if it wasn't Venus, like I said, I don't know, could have been both, I don't know. But what if cultures after that attributed that event to Mercury, and then the echoes of that just kind of came down to us in a weaker form? But, 1,000 years ago, people really believed that, yeah, once Mercury destroyed that tower, whatever that great construction was, it changed everything. It spread humanity out. It changed the languages, either overnight, potentially, which could be interesting, or it changed the languages, over a century or two as the survivors picked up the pieces and started to come back together and started to run into each other again. Yeah, okay. So Mercury is a real problem, and the problems with Mercury are a lot deeper than I think a lot of people truly understand, and that really goes for all of the catastrophes that we have to try to figure out. The Venus event, the Zero event, the Saturnian breakup, the Jupiter situation, etc., etc. There's more going on than just destruction. There's a lot more going on, and the science. Okay. Now, we've got enough examples. I think we can move on. You get my point. So when we look at all of these cultures, we have to ask why. I mean, it's a basic question, and it's a question that historians are not asking. You would think, just going over all of the stuff that I mentioned here, and by the way, this is not an exhaustive example. I'm just going over some of the more known cultures who deal with Mercury. In the future, we'll shove in other cultures as well. It's going to be important. But we have a problem, don't we? Everything that I just went over should immediately cause an issue for anybody who is interested in ancient history. And I don't care what your specialization is. It doesn't matter. We have a situation to where cultures all over this planet, for some weird reason, first of all, are paying attention to Mercury at all. I know it sounds like something that is minor, But think about it. Why are all cultures all across this planet caring about Mercury? I mean, what do they gain out of looking at a small speck in the sky? Right? Why are they tracking that? Who cares? Like, who cares? When was the last time you saw anybody in real life care where Mercury was? And I know you can probably say you have an astrology friend. I get that. But you get my point. Your average person does not care. And even somebody who's into astrology, I guarantee you, I could grab that person and ask them to point to Mercury right now, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And the reason why they couldn't do it is because that kind of astronomy is hard. To know where Mercury is, you've got to know your orbital mechanics. You have got to have an idea of where all of this stuff is, because when we look up at the sky, you can't, it's not obvious. There is nothing obvious about Mercury. Mercury, if it's even in the sky at that point in time, it's just a dot. It's nothing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have any effect on your life. It does not change anything on Earth from a day-to-day basis. There is no reason to care about it. And yet we find cultures all over this planet monitoring it, and not only monitoring it, but for some weird magical reason, they also ascribe identical properties to the planet. So there's two problems that immediately rise up here. Let's go over the simpler one first. Why are you ascribing any kind of a property to a small dot in the sky? Like, what are you doing? And especially, why that specific dot? When was the last time you looked up at the sky and you saw one of the stars and you looked up and you pointed at a specific dot and you said, you know what? I'm going to make that dot represent, I don't know, hatred and lust. You know, just picking random crap, right? Nobody does that because it's stupid. It's a waste of time. It serves no purpose. Now, I'm not saying no. Okay, there's crazy people do that. There's no reason to do it. Your average person is not attributing random properties to a small dot in the sky. It's not happening because there's no reason to. Your average person there's no one's doing that. So why do we have a situation to where not just one culture, but cultures all over this planet, for some weird reason, decide that Mercury needs to have aspects attributed to it? It gets even weirder when you look at the properties that are being attached to the planet itself. So, for some weird reason, not only did all cultures all across this planet suddenly decide that Mercury needed to have anything attached to it at all, but for some magical reason, for some supernatural reason, everybody attributes the exact same properties to the planet. Everybody. Right? All the cultures I just went over unanimously agree for some weird reason. Right? Mercury is the god or the planet of communication, of wisdom. Why? Right? I could see one culture. Fine. For whatever reason, there's one culture that decided to track Mercury, and they were like, you know what? Let's do some symbolism. Let's make that thing that we're tracking, I don't know, let's attribute it to wisdom. Let's do that. And everybody's like, yeah, that's fine. I don't care. I smoked enough crack today. We can do that. Fine. One culture. I could see that. I'll give you one culture. But when you start telling me that another culture and another culture and another culture across the ocean and another culture that's on another continent all attributed the exact same properties to a planet, we have a problem. A mainstream historian will ignore this problem. This is a scientific problem. It's a problem. Yes, I know, I'm angry. I'm calming down. So Mercury is an interesting situation. So for people who are not familiar with this problem, there's a problem. I mean, everything I just said proves it scientifically. For people who do not believe that we have a problem with respect to ancient history, and in this case Mercury, that person is scientifically wrong. So if you run into a historian who is not dealing with this particular problem in their studies, be careful. If an ancient historian has chosen to ignore aspects of a culture's history like this, how can you ultimately trust their work? Because it begs the question, what else are they ignoring? And that's one of our fundamental problems for all of us as historians and scientists when we look at ancient history. Because even if you are on the alternative side, and I'm going to guess that if you are listening to this, you're on the alternative side, the good side, by the way, the right side, the happy side, the correct side, the technically correct side, there is still a good chance that you still believe in a lot of mainstream concepts. And don't forget, right now, we are scientifically proving that the vast majority of the way the mainstream looks at history, it's scientifically wrong. So that's the situation we are in. Anyway, okay, I know, I'm just ranting now. So with respect to Mercury, so we have a problem. So where does Mercury fit into the catastrophic picture of the Saturnian breakup? I've obviously run out of time in this show to go into any of that, but at least we now have a foundation and we have some good questions that we need to start exploring and trying to answer if we are ever going to put together a real picture of what happened in our past. Because one of the problems that we have, that we have to deal with, and it's going to be almost impossible probably at the end of the day, is trying to piece together how all of the catastrophes truly went down, and then how those catastrophes subsequently affected human history and led us to where we are today. Now, that sounds obvious and, whatever, and maybe not that interesting, but think about it. If you throw out all the mainstream garbage and instead we get to 100% replace it with real history and real catastrophes that actually happened, and we acknowledge all of this stuff that has gone on in human history only in the past few thousand years, right? This stuff is not that old. These events are not millions and billions of years old. They're only thousands. That changes everything about who you and I are. Because right now, we are being told who you and I are right now by an authoritative power structure who does not care about us. They are not interested in you having any kind of happiness. They are interested in making sure that you... Okay. Tracking Mercury is going to be important. Not just because Mercury may have been responsible for perhaps a minor catastrophe or two. It sounds like that might have been the case, possibly. Right? And it seems like it might be related to the Venus event in some way or another. This is something I need to do way more research on, and I think we probably just need to go find more evidence for it in general anyway. But aside from the cosmological aspect of Mercury, its orbit and what it did, we need to figure out why Mercury is being attributed to the concept of communication and wisdom and ultimately language. Because language also seems to play a large universal role when it comes to Mercury. Now why? This is the other stuff is a little more easy to understand. Like I said, right? Venus the destroyer. Yes, that makes sense. Venus destroyed the Earth. But Mercury, the wisdom giver? Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, at what point in time is a planetary body going to be able to impart wisdom? Now, there might be, we might, if we look at it from some other perspectives, and I know I'll shut this down in a second, but let's think about this. So Mercury is also personified, isn't he? Right? Thoth, for example. By all intents and purposes, Thoth almost sounds like a real dude. It almost sounds like Thoth was a real being traveling around the world. So it begs the question, if Thoth was a real guy, because it's not impossible, Why would Thoth be related to Mercury? It really does beg the question. I mean, when you had a teacher, have you ever looked at a teacher and thought, wow, I really feel like that dude should be attributed to Neptune? Probably not. You've probably never thought of a teacher being attributed to a planetary body. But why do we find a situation to where Mercury is, it sounds like, being attributed to what sounds like a flesh and blood guy? It's a weird correlation. And it's one we actually have to kind of dive into, and it's one that highlights some of the problems with ancient history. Right? We have a situation throughout ancient history to where we have what seems like a real person, Thoth, I'll just use Thoth, but then they're also attributed to a planetary body. Enki is another one. If you go and you read all of that mythology, you find that Enki seems to be a person running around, or a being. I'll just say a being. I know, that gets weird, I know. But Enki is also attributed to a planetary body. So which is it? Because in both forms, they do something. Right? Thoth and Mercury are both attributed to doing, to executing events that are very down to earth. Right? If a Thoth was a guy and he's running around teaching everybody wisdom, that's not weird. There's nothing crazy about that. That's very believable. Somebody could run around and teach people things. But simultaneously, you have a situation to where Mercury is also being blamed on some destructive processes. So, for example, the Tower of Babel will ultimately be blamed on Mercury. And the concept of the Tower of Babel, of course, is a worldwide concept. It's not just an Abrahamic concept. A lot of people don't know that. The Tower of Babel story is all over the world in many cultures, and its destruction is also related to Mercury. So what sense are we supposed to make of this? So here's our problem, and it's a legitimate problem, and so far as I'm aware, nobody has any of this solved. And I'll also be honest, I don't think anybody's really working on it. I realize in, say, the catastrophism, electric universe areas, everybody loves studying, Venus, especially Saturn, to a lesser extent, Jupiter and Mars. But nobody's really talking about Mercury. And the reason why is because the information is kind of weird, right? We don't have as much information on Mercury as we do of the other planets right now, at least the way it seems. So the door is wide open. Anyway, so we'll do a few more shows later on one day, and we'll get into some more of the deeper concepts of Mercury, and then we'll see if we can't maybe figure some of this stuff out, because we can't ignore Mercury. We can't ignore all these planetary bodies. We can't ignore Uranus. We can't ignore Neptune. Right? We've got to deal with these in the community. And I don't see a lot of people trying to deal with them. And I get why. The information is scarce. I get it. But we got to make an effort. So this is my attempt, and we'll keep trying, and we'll see where this goes. Right? We will see if eventually we can figure out why Mercury is considered the god of wisdom. Not now, later.